What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2007 Volvo XC90 V8 Sport. Today on the XC90 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your front struts as well as your sway bar end links. In front of me, I have two kits which we have available on fcpo.com. We have a SOX strut kit, which includes two new struts as well as your mounting plates and bearings. And we have an OE kit as well, which includes all your hardware needed to do this job, from pinch bolts to the top three 12mm bolts or 13mm bolts, depending on the vehicle, as well as your spring perch and all the needed plates. Added to this, we have some Lem Ford or sway bar end links, and we also have some Lusha springs. The vehicle is equipped currently with some aftermarket quick struts, which we're going to be removing. So we're going to be building a whole new strut from scratch. So if you're looking at how to take your strut apart or assemble a new strut assembly, this is going to be the video for you. A couple of things to take into consideration. As these units get older, your ride quality is going to decrease. You'll hear some groaning, maybe some screeching, a little bit of groans coming from either the strut plates where the bearings start failing, or sometimes the spring perches tear, and then you have metal on metal contact causing for a loud clunk in your suspension. So just keep that in mind if you're considering replacing your struts. Now we know what we're working with, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. And now for tools. For this DIY, we'll be using a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench as well as a 3/8 drive torque wrench. We have a pass-through socket set, which is CTA 7466, which comes in handy whenever you're doing a shock or strut replacement. We have a 19mm socket for our lug bolts. We have a 27mm socket, a 21mm socket. We have a couple of those, both in long and short versions, as well as 1/2-inch and 3/8. We have an extended T45, as well as a T40 and a T30. We have an 18, a 16, a 13, and a 12mm socket, as well as a couple extensions for our 3/8 drive ratchet and our 1/4-inch drive ratchet. We'll be also using a 1/2-inch drive ratchet. We have a 16 and an 18mm wrench, along with a flathead screwdriver, which we'll use to help align our bolt holes for the pinch bolts on the bottom of the strut. Along with that, we have a spring compressor tool. Now, I highly recommend you use a good quality tool if you're going to be doing this at home. If you do not have a proper spring compressor tool, do not do this. Take it to a shop. They can simply take apart your old struts if you're reusing your springs, and or compress the spring and assemble your new strut for you if you do not have this tool. Otherwise, you will get hurt. We have a couple nice to haves, which are electric tools. We have an electric impact as well as an electric ratchet. And then something that comes in handy, not mandatory, but I would recommend if you can get it, is this Volvo strut tool, which is A446 from CTA. And that will take care of that funky cross nut that goes in between the bottom of the top of the spring perch and our strut mount. With that being said, we are working on the lift today. Some things you may want to consider if you're doing this job at home is using an extra floor jack and a couple jack stands to help kind of move the whole hub assembly up and down. That's going to be dependent on the quality of your control arms on your Volvo. Our rig is equipped with brand new control arms, which we did in another DIY. So if anything, it might fight us by going up. But in some cases, your suspension may droop when you disconnect the strut. So just keep that in mind. A screw jack will also come in handy if you're working on a lift like we are today. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, to get started, we're going to start by removing our wheel. We are working on the passenger side today. However, the steps are going to be identical for the driver's side. To get started, we have 5 19mm lug bolts to remove. So we'll grab our impact and zap those off. Now we have our wheel off, we have better access to our workspace. We'll start by moving a couple things out of the way so that we can get the strut out, and then we'll also work on getting our sway bar end link off. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, to get started, we want to make ourselves, give ourselves a little bit of slack once we undo our 2 bolts on here. So to do that, we want to go ahead and remove our cable from the holding clip on the strut, and then we're also going to free it up from this back bracket here as well. This is your ABS cable, so you want to be gentle with it. You don't want to overstretch it by accident when this hub assembly is moving around. And then this is just held on by this white clip up here. That will give us plenty of slack here. The brake line on the other side is going to be fine. It's not going to move too much where this will have any tension on it, so that's good. From there, we're going to want to work on removing our sway bar end link. To do that, we're going to need a counter hold Some of these end links don't have counterholds built into them. It's all depending on what your vehicle is already equipped with. Sometimes you can use some locking pliers on the back or a wrench depending on what brand is in the vehicle. These, I believe, are old Lemporter units, so they have a counterhold that we can use. So for that, we're going to grab our T40 on a small extension on our 3/8 drive ratchet to counterhold, while we use our 18mm wrench to break that nut free and then remove it. The install is going to be exactly the same, actually, so that's kind of nice. So we'll grab our 18, get it set up, counterhold tool. Now, because we are replacing this end link, I'm doing what you're not supposed to do, which is twisting the inside stud. That defeats the purpose of this being our counterhold. When we install our new sway bar end link, you'll see that the ratchet is doing the holding and the 18mm nut will be doing all the spinning. So since these are going to go in the recycling bin, we're not too worried about damaging the ball joint end on here. Now with that off, we're going to go ahead and get under the XC90 and we'll just work on getting the other end off of our sway bar. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, under the XC90, we're going to continue removing the sway bar end link using a 16mm wrench and a T30 on a 1/4" ratchet to counterhold. We'll go ahead and get this off. Slide the end link out. One thing to note on these, they do have two different ends. Your lower end, which we just removed, that's going to be your more smaller stud, if you will. Uses a smaller size nut, 16mm nut. The top end has a more stout end on the ball joint, and that one uses an 18mm nut. So they'll really only go in one way. It's kind of hard to mix them up, but just keep that in mind. We're going to go ahead and set this old unit to the side. We'll bring the car more eye level to us, and now we'll work on removing the lower pinch bolts that hold the strut to the hub. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the 2 pinch bolts that hold our strut to our hub assembly or our knuckle. We have an 18mm head on the bolts and a 21mm nut on the nut side of things. So I'm going to use an 18mm wrench to counter hold the bolt and a 21 on the impact gun to zap off the nuts. And I think you're confused. This is a black impact socket, not a chrome socket. I recommend you replace these again if you can. They are included in that hardware kit, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video, mainly just because you are torquing these plus adding 90 degrees to them. So I would recommend replacing them if you can. We'll go ahead and pull the 2 18s out. Again, I recommend the bottom one first, and then the top one. You'll notice, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, our control arms and everything are pretty fresh, so everything kind of sprung up. You want to be mindful of the bottom of the strut hitting the axle boot. You don't want to tear it or hurt it, so if you're going to move stuff, push down on it a bit and kind of free that up. And just kind of let them hang away from each other, meaning the axle boot not hitting up against the bottom of the strut. So that's nice and loose now. We're going to go ahead and lower the car down a bit, get up underneath the hood, and we'll work on removing the 3 13mm nuts that hold the strut into the strut tower. All right, under the hood of the XC90, we're going to go ahead and remove the 3 13mm nuts that hold the top of our strut in the strut tower. One thing to keep in mind, which you'll see when we do the install, is sometimes when you're replacing items, depending again on what's on the vehicle, your sizes will change for the hardware. So for example, these old nuts are 13mm. The new ones that we will be installing are 12. So that's why you saw we had so many sockets up at the table, just because hardware sizes change as the parts are being changed. So 3 13mm nuts, we're going to go ahead and break them free, zap them off. With one hand, you're going to want to counter hold or hold the strut body underneath the strut tower so that it doesn't come crashing down on your axle or take out the ABS cable or a brake line or anything like that. So we'll go ahead and do that. 13 on the impact. We'll go ahead and just crack these free. third one, I'll do with my left hand while I hold the strut down underneath the strut tower. And now we're simply going to pull this out gently. And here is our old strut. Again, these are aftermarket. We will not be taking these apart, but it's hard to see on camera, but the bearing plate does have some play in it, which is where this car was making a little bit of a clunk. So it's a good thing we're replacing all these. So I'm gonna set this to the side, and then we'll pick it back up over at the vise, which I recommend, or a second set of hands if you're working with a buddy to kind of hold the new strut body so we can assemble our new unit. So this will cover technically the reverse of disassembly while we assemble a new one. Let's get to it. All right, we're over at the vise right now. Again, I highly suggest using a vise or a second set of hands if you have somebody to help you hold the strut while you assemble everything together. This is going to apply again to the disassembly of your old strut, just in the reverse order. So if you're going to do this, obviously you go backwards. But for us, we're going to start with the lower spring perch insulator pad or rubber insulating boot, whatever you want to call it. But basically it only goes on one way. There's two small holes on the strut that these allocating tabs will kind of go into, and you can pull them through and they kind of grip onto the bottom of the perch. So there you go. Now they're nice and sat in there. From there, you're going to want to take your bump stop as well as the top plate that sits on the bump stop. There's two small ears that go into the two notches cut out on this metal washer. Just as simple as laying them over and letting them pop through. This will keep your bump stop in place at the top of the strut, which is where you want it. The aftermarket units actually didn't have this design, which is another reason why we're reusing, or why we're using all good OE hardware. So that way these will be sitting in the proper spot. Just coursing that edge in with the flathead. There we go. The bump stop should poke through just a little bit so it stays in place. The wide end on the dust cover goes down towards the bottom of the strut. The narrow end goes around the first, I guess, middle ring of the bump stop itself. It's kind of a loose fit, but again, it's just a dust cover. Even if it fell off the bump stop, it would bottom out on the strut body here, covering the shaft, which is what you want. That bottoms out there. That's good there. Now at this point, we get to the fun part, which is going to be taking our coil spring and mounting it into our tool that we'll be using today. So we'll go ahead and get that set up quickly, and then we'll pick it up where we're mounting the spring on and getting our upper perch ready for install. So again, I highly suggest, if you don't have a proper tool for this, these are big, hefty springs. Take it to a shop down the road from you. Might charge you a couple bucks, but they'll disassemble your old struts and assemble your new struts as well. So let's go ahead and do that. You want to make sure you have the top of your coil spring and the bottoms set up so you know which way this is going to go on. In this case, the wider end is the bottom of the coil spring, and it's going to bottom out on the perch. There's a little notch cut out in the rubber insulator pad, which we'll point out when we install it, but this will stop it there so that it's aligned properly. Now I'm just going to go ahead and find, I obviously don't want to compress it from top and bottom. I won't be able to get the tool off, so I want to find a nice in-between and use this coil and this whole coil to mount my tool so I can compress it and still get the tool out when I'm done. And now I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. Once you have your spring situated properly in the tool, you know it's not going to go anywhere, you can go ahead and start compressing it. We can check it here to see if it'll clear the top of the shaft. If not, we'll compress it a little bit more. So that's where we want our spring to sit. We want to make sure that the top perch, which also has a stop built into it where my index finger is, that is going to want to line up with the end of the top coil when we get it seated in there. Maybe something like this. So in this case, I need to go down a little bit more. I'll keep this here since it's pretty much set into place and just snug it down a little bit more. We've compressed the spring a bit more to get it to clear the top of the shaft here when we put our top portion of the strut mount slash spring perch. Then we can start our funky X nut with the space side facing the bottom towards the top of the spring perch. And then this is where that funny CTA tool will come in handy. Again, if you don't have that, you can use a punch. Again, you might want to have a second set of hands to help you out, but we got that specialty socket. It just kind of helps hold everything a little bit easier. Once the X nut bottoms out, it'll just stop, at which point you can snug it up if you want by hand with the ratchet, but it doesn't really take much. This is more of a stopper than anything. So there we go. We'll go ahead and just give it a little snug with the 27mm socket. It's good. You don't want to spin the whole shaft. You just want to make sure it's snug. Then once that is nicely situated, we can go ahead and get rid of this ticking time bomb, which is the spring compressor. All right. Now that we have that off, we can continue adding the rest of the strut top here. So next is going to be our top plate. It's going to sit somewhere like that. This will obviously rotate anywhere we need it to once we install the strut, but it's usually the flat portion facing outwards towards the wheel. Then from there, we'll take our washer. It's got 5 nubs at the bottom. Those are going to lay on top of this bearing here, flat side to the top. And then we can take our locking nut, start that by hand. This is where those pass-through sockets are going to come in handy. We're going to be using the combination of the 21mm on the pass-through set along with our T50 to counter hold. And we're just going to snug that up as best as we can. Now with our torque wrench, we can go ahead and just make sure this nut is tightened out at 70 Newton meters. If you're having trouble tightening it down while it's either on a vise or maybe it's just you and a buddy putting this together, you can always retorque it and recheck it once it is in the vehicle. All right. Now with that installed, all that we really have left to do to make this a complete strut is add our ABS retaining clip, which we'll do off of the vise since it's kind of hidden from the camera. So I'll pull this off. We'll show you how to add this on, and then we'll go ahead and install it in our XC90. Now just note, again, what side you're working on. We're working on the passenger side, so we want our clip to be on the left-hand side of the strut. If you're working on the driver's side, you want it on the opposite side, of course. So we're gonna go ahead and line up the 2 small dowels into the strut body here. And just pinch in, and then you can use a small flathead screwdriver or something similar to push these locking tabs in. They're like an expanding rivet, essentially. And there you have it, my good people. Now this is one complete strut ready to go back into our XC90. So I'll catch you over at the truck and we'll go ahead and get this done. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and install our new strut. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you wanna make sure that the flat portion of the plate is facing outwards. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this situated in the wheel well first, and then I'll feed it up, and then we'll start the new 12mm nuts. right. We'll start these 12 mils by hand first. Again, the new hardware is 12, the old hardware was 13. Just keep that in mind. Stay. Then we can torque all three of these down to 25 Newton meters. Now we have everything torqued up. I'm gonna go ahead and mark everything with the paint pen. And then from there, we can go ahead and install our dust cap that goes over the 21 millimeter nut, which is included with the OE hardware kit, should you buy that. Now that we have that all wrapped up, let's head back underneath the wheel well and button up the rest of this strut install. Now we have our strut situated up in the strut tower. We're gonna work on getting it lined up with our knuckle. Again, as I mentioned, this one kind of sprung up a little bit since our arms are nice and fresh. In some situations, it may droop. Just be mindful of the axle. You don't want to put too much strain in that either and accidentally pop it out. Same thing with your ABS cable and your brake line. You want to make sure these don't have any tension on them. You can always use a bungee cord to kind of hold everything together while you work on the top end of things. Now we're going to go ahead and line these two up. I'm going to use a flathead screwdriver to kind of help align my bolt holes together as I get this situated. All right, now we have our two new 18 millimeter bolts fed through. We can go ahead and get our nut started on the other end. Make sure there's no debris on the threads. And then I'll initially use the impact with the 21 on there to snug it down, and then we'll torque them up with the torque wrench. All right, I got my 18 to counter hold. I have my black impact 21 millimeter socket. And we'll go ahead and snug these up. With both of those snugged up, now we're gonna go ahead and torque our two nuts to 105 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So we'll set the torque wrench to 105. And then we may still need to counter hold with the 18. I'll give it a shot without it first. And now some torque wrenches have angle settings. There's also adapters that you can use in between your normal ratchet and socket. In this case, this one has a angle setting, so we'll set it to 90. But something else you can do if you don't have any of that at home is simply use a paint pen. You can mark a spot on the nut and then just make sure you make it over 90 degrees and you'll be good. We have our torque wrench set to 90. There's 90. And you can also see possibly that paint mark moved itself exactly 90 degrees. So do the same thing on the bottom one. $90. All right, and then from there, if you want, I like to paint mark everything once I have it torqued down nicely, just so I know it's not moving on me. At this point, we're going to keep our ABS cable loose, and we're going to go ahead and feed our new soy bar end link. You want to make sure the end link is to the interior of the cable. Top part of the end link is going to go into the left side of the strut here. Again, this was the bigger end with the 18 millimeter nut and the T40 counter hold. We'll just go ahead and feed that through and get it started. That's enough for now. I like to leave it loose. Now we'll go ahead and get underneath the XC90 and we'll start the bottom portion, tighten that back up, and then we'll come back up here and wrap everything up and snug this down. Down below, we're going to go ahead and install the smaller end of our sway bar end link to the sway bar itself. We'll take off the new 16mm nut that comes with it. Just kind of feed it through. We'll start it by hand. And then we'll grab our 16mm wrench. Pass-through sockets work well here as well. And then we'll use our T30 to counter hold. Again, you want to avoid spinning the ball joint end. You want to just tighten down the nut so you don't add any additional wear to it. Once it's kind of tight, then we can go ahead and torque it down to 50 Newton meters. 16mm socket, 50 Newton meters. There we go. Not a whole lot. You already know the good drill here, my good people. Now let's head back up top. We'll tighten the 18 up there to 50 as well and continue buttoning up this DIY. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten down the 18mm nut on the top half of our end link. I'm going to use a pass-through socket for this one. You can use a wrench as well, but the pass-through will make it a little bit quicker for us right now. And a T40 to counter hold. Again, you want to make sure you're not spinning the ball joint end. You just want to tighten down the nut. That way you don't put any additional wear on your new end link. And then we'll make sure that's snug down to 50 Newton meters. There we go. Give her a little mark. Now we're going to go ahead and feed our cable back into this white plastic clip. Following the bracket next to it, the grommet just slides in. And then over to our new clip on the strut itself. Beautiful. Now from there, my good people, all we have left to do is to reinstall our wheel and we can wrap up this DIY. Now we can go ahead and install our wheel. And we'll go ahead and get the 5 19mm lug bolts started. We'll snug them down with the impact gun, and then we'll lower down the XC90 and torque them with the torque wrench. Now we can go ahead and torque our lug bolts down to 135 Newton meters. And there you have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. Overall, a really straightforward job on the P2 XC90. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, or there's specific DIYs you want to see be done, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.